If you have a pulse, you probably hate the subject of taxes and running the bookkeeping portion of your business. But like it or not, if you want to be a successful podcaster, you are going to have to pay attention to your numbers. But don't worry, we have the answer for you, Core Financial. Our friends over at Core Financial have taken the pressure off of us so we can focus on what we love doing most, running our podcast. They take care of all of our taxes, monthly bookkeeping, financial plans, and make sure we take full advantage of all of the tax benefits we qualify for. It just feels good knowing we aren't going to get a big surprise during tax season. If you are serious about building a business with your podcast, head on over to howtomakeapodcast.co/core to see what they can do for you. Hello and welcome to episode number 1 of How to Make a Podcast, a brand new podcast from me, John Bunn, and my co-host, Nick Miller. Nick Miller, why don't you say hello, introduce yourself. What are we doing with this thing? What's happening?
Yeah, well, hello everyone. Like John said, my name is Nick Miller, and we have decided to launch this brand new podcast. This is episode 1. We're taking you on a journey all about how to make a podcast. We host the How to Film Weddings podcast. It is a wedding videography podcast, and we've recorded well over 100 episodes of that. And we get lots of questions all the time about how are you doing this? You know, how have you made your podcast successful? How have you monetized? How have you grown it? How have you made this community? All these kind of questions. And so we thought that it would be cool to launch a brand new podcast called How to Make a Podcast. So that's what we are going to talk about during this podcast. Is how to make a podcast, and we're going to keep track of how many times we say the word podcast while recording this podcast.
If you're into drinking or drinking games, you know, every time we say the word podcast, take a drink. So have fun with that. We're really excited. Like Nick said, we have How to Film Weddings, and now we have How to Make a Podcast. So if we accidentally say How to Film Weddings when we're supposed to say How to Make a Podcast, just bear with us for a little bit while we get our bearings straight. But it really came down to this, Nick. Like, we built this community over at How to Film Weddings, and we started doing these episodes. We started getting paid. We started launching courses and started doing all within, a year and a half. And it has now become something, that I never even thought was possible, which it's like paying my mortgage, and it's paying us a salary, and it's written us very big checks, and we have sponsors, and we've traveled all over the place, and we're getting to go all around the world. We have speaking engagements, and we launched our course, and there's just so many different things, and people are like, how are you doing this? What is this? And so this podcast, we're going to break it all down, a weekly episode, kind of just taking, is it a weekly episode?
I would say I would start off by saying monthly.
A monthly to weekly-ish episode. And by the way, we've learned with the podcast, we just don't cut stuff out anymore. We just talk, and then we just figure it out later. But an episode pretty often for you. We'll figure it out as we go. Talking about all these different things and helping you get to that dream of maybe hosting your own podcast if you haven't started one yet, or making good money doing it, because that's the ultimate dream for us. Like, we wanted to be able to talk, hang out, and get paid to do it. And that is actually what is happening. And so we're doing that now, Nick, but how did we get there? Because I felt like episode 1, maybe we should tell these people who we are, how we got here, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So you might be listening to this, like, who are these guys? Why do they have the authority to tell us how to make a podcast? Where did it all come from? All that kind of stuff. So we just wanted to start at the beginning of the launch of our first YouTube channel and podcast, How to Film Weddings, and kind of go through there and then talk to you about how we were actually able to make around $250,000. That's right, $250,000 in our first 18 months of doing this. And whenever we really break it down, it was really in the second 7 to 8 months that we really made that money. So we were kind of doing this for about a year, and then the money started coming in. So we're just going to break it all down for you. John and I, by trade, our day jobs are wedding videographers. I'm based in Wichita, Kansas, and my wedding video company is Wild Oak Films. John is in Tulsa, Oklahoma. His company's name is Redeemed Productions. And one Saturday, he needed a second shooter in Oklahoma City for a wedding, and he looked me up, he found me, and he said, "Hey, Nick, I need a second shooter. We had never met before. Come down and shoot this wedding with me. So as we're there, we started talking, and before I was a full-time wedding videographer, I was actually a youth pastor for 11 years. And leaving that job, I was grateful to transition into doing wedding video full time. But there was kind of a hole left within me when I left that job, and that was teaching, education. I loved getting in front of people and talking and teaching. And so as John and I got together, he kind of had that bug in his ear too, that desire inside of him to become a teacher, to become an educator. And so after that wedding, I started asking him questions about how are you charging so much? How are you making all this money? Because at the time, I was charging around $2,800 to $3,000 for a wedding film, and John was in like the $6,000 to $8,000 range for a wedding film. And I was just like, my jaw hit the floor, because I was like, how are you charging this much? And so I would ask him questions, and then he was like, well, how are you coloring your films this way? How are you getting them to look this way and sound this way? And so the things that I was really good at, I could help him with, and the things that he was good with, he could help me with. And so we just started talking, and we created this YouTube channel, How to Film Weddings, which then led into a podcast a few months later. So that's kind of a quick abridged story. John, I will let you add maybe some things that you would like to add, because I know you always have things to say.
I like saying things. That is something about me, of course, as a podcast host. Yeah, you said it. I mean, I'm here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I've been running my company since 2007. And ever since I was a kid, I always just had this knack for selling things and, advertising and marketing, and just saw things from that side of things, even when I was at a young age. I remember really heavily investing into Beanie Babies at one point when I think I was 8 with my life savings, knowing I was going to make a lot of money, selling those on the Beanie Baby black market or something. I have no idea what I was thinking or doing, but baseball cards and or whatever, always having this entrepreneurial thing about me. And as I started to grow and learn, I went to school for advertising and marketing, started working at a church, then got asked by a friend to film their wedding, and I saw I could make some money doing this, and continually pushed my brand until I was making, upwards of $10,000 or $15,000 to film someone's wedding. And it was just like nothing really about the shooting or editing. But it was mainly about the relationship and the way that I had built my company and my brand and the reputation, and had worked my way up slowly and steadily. And we'll talk about that a lot in this podcast, just about how building that brand, I took it slow and steady until I got to a point where I could continually push my prices and push them. And that really, struck a chord with a lot of people in the wedding film industry. And I'm realizing that that's not just for wedding films. That's for, we applied those same principles to How to Film Weddings, the podcast, and it started really growing and picking up. And so like Nick was saying, we started a YouTube channel in 2018 in March or April. And then by the end of that year, we were like, maybe we should start a podcast. We recorded an episode, put it out there. It was really nerve-wracking, which I'm sure if you're out there, if you have a podcast or if you're thinking about one, it's nerve-wracking to put your information out there and see if anybody takes to it. But we had this plan that's like, we're not going to make much money, if anything, for 2 years probably. Are you good with that, Nick? Am I good with that, Nick? Are you good with that, Nick? Am I good with that? And it's like, we knew that if we, I had to clear my throat and I lost my train of thought. But anyway, we had to definitely count the cost. And, lo and behold, it was, I think, 7 or 8 months in when we actually made any money. And so, yeah, I mean, it went from this thing that nobody knew about to now the largest wedding filmmaking podcast in the world. We've had hundreds of thousands of downloads. We've made, we have 4 major sponsors. We've done all these things, and it is paying us, a ton of money, over $15,000 a month at this point. And we have always been just an open book on what we're doing. We don't think we know it all. Like Nick was saying, why are we the authority? We're not. We're just 2 guys that host a podcast. Have done some things again and again and grown and kept growing, and it's now snowballing. And so we want to help you out there listening if that's something that you want to do too, all mixed in with good conversation, us messing up a lot and not editing that out of our episodes.
Yeah. One thing I do want to put out there is John had actually had this fear whenever we started going. He was like, well, who am I? right? Who am I to record this YouTube videos to get into the education space? Who am I? And as we sat down and we kind of talked through that, combined, whenever we started How to Film Weddings, we had close to 20 years of experience between the two of us in the wedding filmmaking industry.
Between the two of us, we had 20 years of experience. And that accounts for something. And if you're sitting here right now listening to this and was like, man, well, you guys have all this experience and that kind of stuff, guess what? If you have some knowledge on some topic that you want to talk about in your podcast, there is someone somewhere that can learn from it. Okay, as long as you are 2 or 3 or 4 steps ahead of people behind you, then they can learn from the things that you have to say. And were there people that we had on our How to Film Weddings podcast that were more experienced with us, that were more successful than us, that were making more money than us? Absolutely. But there was a large audience of people that hadn't been creating wedding films for very long that we could speak to, and we could pull from our experience to teach them. So as you're wanting to launch a podcast and do that, that's something to think about. You don't have to be a quote unquote expert in the field. You just need to be a few steps ahead of someone else that wants to learn on the subject that you want to talk about. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's kind of like, if you're a teacher of a class, you just need to be 1 or 2 chapters ahead of your students. It's kind of like that. And, for us, we were like, when I was a kid, I really just wanted to have David Letterman's job. I wanted to sit and talk with celebrities and have fun. And then Jimmy Fallon came along and I was like, I want to be like him even more, where it's just turning these celebrities or whatever into attainable, reachable people, kind of getting a glimpse into their world. And, we just wanted something that was more fun and entertaining and at the same time, informative and helpful. And, watching the episodes back now that we've done over 100, from the beginning till now, it didn't start out just super easy. We kind of got our flow and we're still just, being 2 dudes that are talking or whatever, but being able to watch that grow, being able to push it forward, that has been some of the best, things in our entire careers. And after we did this for a while, like Nick was saying, we had so many people just being like, wait, you have a lot of sponsors. You're doing this different than us. I've got a podcast myself. I've done this many episodes. I can't get anybody to pay me anything. I can't, I don't know how to market it. And it reminds me, whenever I first met Nick, his wedding films were better than mine. And they're still better than mine, but he's shaking his head yes if you're not watching this. But his wedding films were cooler, they were more on trend, they looked better, they were shot clean, and I was charging almost 3 times as much because I was much better at getting people to see my weddings than he was, and that's what the difference was the distribution. And I remember telling him, and it haunts him, I think, but I remember telling him, dude, if I had your wedding films, I'd be charging double what I'm charging right now. And it all comes down to distribution, getting people to listen to your podcast or watch your films or whatever that is. And so that's one of the main things that we want to help you figure out, how to get that pure audience, get those people listening to your podcast that want to be there and building that community around it. So we have a ton of ideas for the future. We want to take your ideas too. So I'm going to throw a plug for our Facebook group. Just search How to Make a Podcast on Facebook. We've got an awesome community in there already, but we're answering lots of questions and we're going to be pulling a lot of information from the questions we ask in there to make episodes on everything that we've done. So it's going to be a ton of fun. This inaugural episode, we wanted to show you kind of who we were, where we came from. Nick, are we missing anything about our story?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it very, very well. Yeah, again, we're going to plug our Facebook group. Just search How to Make a Podcast in Facebook. You can find the group there. And one of the things that we have said a couple of times is we have made $250,000 in our first 18 months of running our How to Film Weddings podcast. And we wanted to give you something. So we are actually going to break down how we made $250,000 on our podcast right after this break. So you've got everything you need for your podcast. You've recorded your audio and video. You're so excited. But wait, you don't know how to master the audio or edit the video of your podcast. We know someone who can help. The podcast editors. Picture this. You record both audio and video for your podcast. You upload it to your remote editor, and a few days later, your podcast is ready for you to upload and push to the world. What will you do with your extra time? Connect with sponsors? Grow your Facebook group? Start that project or even course you have dreamed of for months? The possibilities are endless. We are blown away by the podcast editors and love working with them and using their services. They can edit audio, video, or both for your podcast. Don't get stuck trying to do this on your own. Get in touch with the podcast editors today. If you'd like to save 50% off of your first project, head over to howtomakeapodcast.co/thepodcasteditors.
We can't tell you how frustrating it was for us to upload our podcast when we first got started. The websites were clunky, we had data limits, and it was all so confusing. That is until we found Zencastr. Zencastr is an online platform built for podcasters to not only upload their podcast, but track their listeners, connect to their audience, and so much more. Zencastr's plans have no upload or download limits, so your costs won't grow as you do. Embed their player that automatically updates to show the latest episodes of your show. Zencastr lets you see your podcast downloads along with your web traffic in Google Analytics. Zencastr also supports multiple podcasts under one account. The best part is, if you already have a podcast on another platform, you can switch to Zencastr with a one-click importer, all free of charge. So what are you waiting for? Head on over to howtomakeapodcast.co/Zencastr to start saving time and money with your podcast today.
And we are back. We are going to jump into our HoneyBook question of the day. Our question of the day presented by HoneyBook. And if you would like more information on our CRM of choice, go to howtomakeapodcast.co/HoneyBook, and you can find more information there. John, our question of the day presented by HoneyBook is this: how did we make $250,000 by hosting a podcast?
Oh, I love this question. It is a very detailed question. There's a lot of ways we did this, but I would start it by saying slow and steady and with a pure audience. And so it wasn't about getting my mom to download it just so I could have another number of somebody downloading. It was a very strategic, slow and steady and well thought out process. And, you know, when we think about it, there were 5 major ways that we did this, and so we want to just break those down for you. The very first one is we built an email list. Now, this isn't the sexiest of topics. It's not like, what? You built an email list? But here's the thing. Email lists are so important. There are so many courses about building email lists, but what it comes down to is that if you have a list of loyal followers that you can send an email to, you own that data. You're not subject to the algorithms or, you know, Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever it is. And so, you know, at the time of recording this, we have almost 7,000 people on our email list. And every time that we produce an episode or, you know, we have a new piece of content or we have a course we're coming out with or different things like that, we can send that email to that list. And so having a pure list of people that are active and warm and ready to buy from you, that, my friends, is the number one way that we did this.
Yeah. Have you, we hear it all the time, right? Where you're sitting there and the Instagram algorithm changes, right? You're like, I'm finally just starting to get some traction. You know, I'm getting hundreds of likes and a few comments and like that kind of stuff on my posts, and people are finding me. And then the algorithm changes, and then you're kind of like starting over from square one. Okay. The great thing about social media is that it is free. The bad thing about social media is that you do not own it. Okay, so you're uploading to Instagram or Facebook or even YouTube and Twitter and TikTok and all these different social medias, but you don't own that platform. So what happens when Facebook shuts down or Instagram shuts down or YouTube shuts down? Now, those are massive companies. They're not shutting down. But I remember about a year ago, whenever there was a day whenever Facebook shut down, and like it was like people didn't know what to do, because they're running these businesses and that's the way that they are connecting with their clients. But an email list circumvents that. Okay, if you have an email provider, they are like something like MailChimp or ActiveCampaign. That's the one we use, is ActiveCampaign. And if you have that, you are paying for them to store your email addresses. And whenever you get those email addresses, like, they're yours now. And you are the one that dictates what type of content that gets pushed out, what type of content they see. And so you are able to then reach out to them and communicate with them in a way that you feel is beneficial to get your message across.
Yeah, and this is just going to be a skimming of how we did this. We'll go deeper in more episodes just about email lists or things, but I want to throw it out there too. If you're listening to this podcast, especially at the early days of this, we have started building an email list for how to make a podcast. And to pull the curtain back, we have a freebie right now, a PDF through Facebook that is, a downloadable link that's for free. We've created an opt-in. So you might have seen an ad that says, do you want to make $15,000 a month? Or we made that much a month podcasting, or just an ad for how to make a podcast. You clicked over to it. You saw value in what we provided. You signed up for the email list. And now we've emailed you saying, hey, we have a podcast. Listen in. This is exactly what we did now and are now doing with this podcast that we did with How to Film Weddings. But How to Film Weddings, we didn't start building this email list until like we were 40 or 50 episodes in. And if we could start over today, we would do it just like we're doing now, which is, we're starting this podcast. So we are building this podcast to show you all the things that we would do now. It's kind of like Inception, it's a podcast on podcasting, teaching you to podcast. Drink up, everybody. But it's like, okay, we've run these ads. We've targeted people that are interested in podcasts that we think would be a good fit. And if you've clicked that, you've downloaded it. Now you're on our email list. We're not going to spam you with that email. But we're going to give you valuable things like this podcast episode or different things. And so now you are on our email list, and we're going to give you so much free content that who knows, sooner or later, 1% of you or 2% of you might buy something from us or buy our course on podcasting, and we're not, like, what's been cool about building this is, like, we're not in this to only sell things. We've given hundreds and hundreds of free hours of content. So some of you may never buy anything from us at all, and that's cool. Some of you may buy some stuff. And so that email list, though, by building it and growing it, even if you don't buy anything from us, by having thousands and thousands of people downloading our episodes, we can then go to sponsors and say, hey, sponsor, we've got this many people that are interested in podcasting. We'd like to talk to you about maybe, promoting your product. And so there's ways to make money by building that audience. And so that email list is that first step. And if you can build that and continually have some ads running or ways for people to join that email list, you're going to start to really grow your podcast. Because if you have 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 people on your list, whenever you drop an episode, you can say, hey, we've got this new episode. Check it out. Click the link right here. And that many people are clicking over and now listening and watching. So
yeah,
huge.
Definitely. It's huge. And one of the things that John mentioned there with have the email list and how point number 2 about how to make the money that we did was through sponsorships. Okay. Yep. We have made sponsorships. And I think that there is a misconception out there that, okay, I'm a wedding videographer and I have a wedding video podcast. So now all of these companies are going to start lining up and trying to get a hold of me to have them sponsor themselves on our podcast. And I think that is the problem that a lot of people have is, for the most part, now there's certain people that really like to brag about themselves, but for the most part, we don't like to brag about ourselves. We don't like to talk about ourselves unless it's in a certain situation. And so one of the things that John did very early on, whenever we were talking about getting sponsors for our How to Film Weddings podcast, was he was like, okay, we need to reach out to MusicBed. And MusicBed is a music licensing service that many wedding videographers use. And he's like, we need to reach out to them. We both use them. We both like them. Let's see if they might talk to us about sponsoring our podcast. And so we actually reached out to them, started a conversation. We had their CEO of MusicBed on our podcast. And from that, it led to a sponsorship of our podcast. And so, I think, again, with sponsors, that's a misconception. People aren't going to, if you're a hunting company, let's say that's your podcast is all about hunting and stuff. A company like, Cabela's or Bass Pro isn't going to knock on your door and hit you up and say, hey, we'd like to sponsor you. But if you have all of this information where you have this massive email list and you're getting hundreds of thousands of downloads, a month or a year or something like, and you reach out to them with that data, they might say, you know what, it might be worth us to sponsor you. Okay. So when it comes to sponsors, you need to kind of get, excited, pumped up for your podcast and reach out to people.
Yeah, and a lot of people think that, there's different things, if you get so many downloads on Libsyn, which is the company we use to upload our podcast, like they'll auto place ads on your episodes, or they think that you can only get, $10-15 per ad, things like that on there. And so what I've really learned and what's really different about what, I don't want to be like the status quo and just get small amounts for sponsors, but by having that pure audience of wedding filmmakers, whenever we say, hey, we've got 5,000 wedding filmmakers that love and we've built brand with them and they trust us, we use your product and we love it. If we, form this relationship, we can tell our 5 or 6 or 10,000 followers about your brand. And that's very, very valuable to certain people. One of our sponsors edits wedding films, and they really don't need any other advertising and don't have any other advertising, but pay us thousands of dollars per month for us to run an advertisement on our episode. We have a link on our website. And so of the money that comes in, of the 15,000+ right now, right at 10,000 of that a month comes in from just sponsors paying to have advertisements on our episodes. And so, like Nick said, when we had MusicBed CEO on, that was early. And then like 3-4 months later, after continually building that relationship, I had talked to the CEO's assistant and just said, hey, if you're interested, we would love to maybe promote MusicBed to our listeners. And then like a month later, I was like, I'm just checking back in. We're growing. I wanted to send you some of these numbers. We're growing. Everything's going well. A lot of and started, showing this proof of concept and saying, if you're interested. And then lo and behold, a couple months later, she reached back out and was like, hey, sorry, we've been launching a campaign. We want to launch that campaign through, How to Film Weddings. And we were able to say, okay, cool. And we gave them like a really good deal. We went way above and beyond. We made them like a video commercial. We did all these things. And again, we'll go deep into some of these subjects, as our podcast progresses. But long story short, now they're paying us double what they started paying us. They have signed up for, I think it's 14 or 15 months now of them being a sponsor, and we have sent hundreds of people to them to get like a membership, and it's been really a great deal for both people. Same thing with the wedding editing service, and that has really changed our business. When we had those sponsors in, that added validity to what we did, and it made the listeners really realize that we weren't messing around. This was like a real deal show, and that all just folds back on top of itself, providing just this incredible value to not only your sponsors, but to your listeners.
Yeah, a phrase that you may have heard a lot if you've been in sales and kind of stuff is there are riches in the niches. And, I guarantee you that this wedding editing company would much rather send their business to us for advertising, where maybe we're going to get 5,000 people that are going to listen to them and hear their ad, each month or whatever. They would much rather do that than spend money, the same amount of money, on a company that has millions of listeners each month. But how many of them are actually wedding videographers? Okay. So, you might look up, statistics on, how much you should get paid per episode and all of that kind of stuff. And again, we'll get into this, but people are willing to pay a premium price for an audience that John said earlier is pure. And so that's how we were doing it. Wedding videographers make up well over 90% of our other podcast. And the other 10% are probably wedding photographers interested in getting into wedding video. Okay. So it's almost exclusively wedding videographers. And so these companies are willing to provide for that and pay for that. So anyway, those are, go for it. You have something else to say.
Yeah, I think so many people think they have to have 1 million downloads or 100,000 downloads an episode or something like that. And as it sits, the biggest month we've ever had with How to Film Weddings, I think was like 17,000 downloads in the whole month. On our audio, and maybe another 10,000 views on YouTube. So it's really a few thousand people listening in. It's not a crazy amount. And so, looking at those first two things, the building an email list, that's where you get started and start building, and then, bringing in sponsors. Those two ways are definitely, the biggest ways that we've generated the majority of our income. So that was all I wanted to add.
Okay, thank you for doing that. So there you have it. Building an email list and sponsors are how we have made two of the ways that we have made $250,000 from our podcast. We wanted to keep these episodes a little bit shorter, somewhere in the 25 to 30 minute range. So we're actually going to cut it off right here, right now. In episode 2, we are going to fill in the other 3 ways that we made that money. But what I want you to do right now, if you are interested at all in creating a podcast, to monetizing your podcast, to doing some of these things that we have talked about, we want you to head over to podcastblueprint.co. And at podcastblueprint.co, you can sign up and purchase a course that John and I have put together about how we have done this, how we have created our podcast brand, how we have monetized it, how we have made a living off of just creating a podcast. And we break it all down. We don't hold anything back. So if you are interested in monetizing your podcast, seeing how we do it, head over to podcastblueprint.co. Thank you so much for listening to the inaugural episode of How to Make a Podcast. And until next time, we'll see ya.
We'll see ya.